So how come our item is not deselected? Well, here's the code. And this is the line where we set selected playlist to null. Then how come the item was not deselected? Can you think of the reason? That's because we have not implemented iNotify property changed interface. So even though we set this to null, and in our XAML we are using binding, our list view is not aware of this change. So we need to implement iNotify property changed interface. But before we go there, I just noticed a tiny problem here. This xName attribute. We had this earlier because we were referencing this list view in our code behind. Now we don't need it anymore, so delete. Now here's a simple tip. When you implement MVVM, ideally you should not have xName attribute in your XAML. The only exception is if you have this xName here, and you're referencing this somewhere else in your binding expressions in this XAML file, but not in the code behind. So delete. Now back in our view model, you want to implement iNotify property changed interface here. But before we do this, I want to show you that I have already implemented this somewhere else. So in the solution, inside models folder, we have this playlist. Look, I have already implemented this here. So we have the event, and we also have this useful helper method on property changed. So it doesn't make sense to repeat all this code in another class. I'm going to create a new class and move this code that I'm going to reuse in multiple places there. So inside view models folder, I'm going to add a new class and call this BaseViewModel. Now I want this to implement iNotify property changed interface. Let's bring in the namespace and implement the interface, which adds this event to our class. Now I'm going to go back into playlist, cut this method from here, put it in our BaseViewModel, and then I'm going to change this to protected, because we're going to call this in the classes that derive from BaseViewModel. And by the way, let's resolve the namespace for caller member name. Okay, beautiful. Now back in the playlist, we don't have onProperty changed anymore. We also don't need this event here, delete. Now instead of implementing iNotify property changed, I want to derive this from BaseViewModel. But hang on a sec, what am I doing here? This playlist is part of our domain model. Why am I deriving this from a class that is part of the presentation layer? I know, this is not right, but this is step-by-step refactoring, so bear with me. Okay, now that we have this BaseViewModel, instead of implementing this interface directly, we derive this from BaseViewModel. Now, to support data binding for this property, we are going to create a private field, playlist, selected playlist. And then we need to fully implement this property. So in the getter, we simply return this selected playlist field. In the setter, first we check if the value we're getting is the same as what we have in our field. If it's the same, we return. Otherwise, we set the value and call onProperty changed. Now, before we go any further, let's run the application and make sure the problem with selection is solved. So add a few playlists. Select. Beautiful. It's deselected. So everything is working. Let's go back to the code. Look at the implementation of this setter. This pattern looks familiar, doesn't it? First, we check the value. If it's the same as what we have in the private field, we return. Otherwise, we set the value and then call onProperty changed. And we have the exact same pattern in the implementation of isFavoriteProperty in our playlist class, except that here we have an additional call to onProperty changed. But if we put this aside, these three lines are exactly the same. So I want to move this logic to our BaseViewModel so we can reuse it. So here's the base view model. I'm going to declare a protected method, protected void set value. And I want this to be generic because I want to use it for setting value of different private fields. So the first parameter should be t, and we call this backing field. The second parameter is t value. Now, if this is confusing you, let me show you how we're going to use this. So in our playlists view model, instead of these three lines, I'm going to call set value, pass our backing field, which is selected playlist, and the target value, which is this value keyword. So like this. And we can put it on one line. Okay. Now back in the base view model, there is just one problem here. If our backing field is a value type, like an integer, a boolean, a character, as you know, these value types are copied by value. So we get a copy of that private field in this method. When setting the value, we want to set the value in the actual private field. So to fix this issue, we need to use the ref keyword. And this will send that value type by reference. What if our private field is a reference type? This will allow us to set this reference type to a new object. Now here, we want to check if the value of backend field is the same as this value argument. You may think we can do it easily, like if backend field equals value. But this doesn't work. Look at the error message. This operator cannot be applied to operands of type t, because here we don't know what is the type of t. It's a generic method. So the way around this is to use the equality comparer class. Let's bring in the namespace. It's defined in system.collections.generic. So this is one of the classes in this namespace. It has a static property called default. So this will give us an object that we can use to compare objects of type t. And now with this, we can call equals, pass our backend field and the target value. Now, if it's the same, we want to return. Otherwise, we set backend field to this value and then call onPropertyChanged. Now, there is a problem here. Because we have not set the property name here, this color member name attribute is going to come into the picture. So it will get the name of the color and use that as the property name. In this case, the name of the color is setValue method, because this is where we're calling onPropertyChanged method. But what we want is the name of the actual property. So if we are in our view model, inside selected playlist property, we want this name to be used as the property name. The workaround is very simple. Back here, we add another optional argument here, string property name, set it to null, so it's optional. And one more time, we use color member name. Now, because we're calling this setValue method from our property, this color member name, again, comes to the picture. It automatically sets this property name. And then here, we can simply pass this property name to onPropertyChanged method. Now, everything is in the right place. Let's just finish this lecture. I'm going to go in the view model. We have a red underline here because we have declared this parameter using the ref modifier, so we need to apply that here. Now, similarly, in playlist class, I'm going to replace these three lines with a call to set value. We pass this private field by reference, is favorite, and the value. Now, as I said, this playlist is a domain class, and it should not derive from a class that is part of the presentation layer. So in the next lecture, we're going to fix this problem.